The Harwick County Fairgrounds smelled like gunpowder, cut grass, and dog. It always did during the Regional K9 Championship, 3 days of precision tracking trials, obedience demonstrations, and tactical simulations that drew law enforcement teams from across 6 states. This year, over 2,000 spectators had packed the bleachers on the final Saturday morning, their breath fogging in the raw October air, their eyes fixed on the competition field, where 8 of the most decorated police dogs in the northeastern United States stood in perfect formation. Nobody was watching the woman near the chain-link fence at the far end of the grounds. She had arrived before the gates opened. A county parking volunteer had almost turned her away, assuming she was a lost fairgoer looking for the craft barn. She wore a canvas work jacket the color of old mud, the kind sold in feed stores for $30, and her dark hair was pulled back in a rough knot that had been losing the fight against the wind since early morning. Her jeans were clean but faded, and her boots were the worn, steel-toed kind that had spent more time in fields than on pavement. She carried a battered canvas tote bag over one shoulder. She was 28 years old, and she looked like she'd driven a very long way. Her name was Soleil Adair. She stood at the fence with both hands wrapped around the chain link, watching the field with an intensity that had nothing to do with the competition. She wasn't watching the handlers in their pressed uniforms. She wasn't watching the obstacle courses or the tracking lanes. Her eyes moved slowly, deliberately, across the line of dogs, and there was something in her expression, a kind of desperate, searching grief that made her look far older than she was. Captain Dex Thurlow, the head of the Harwick County K9 unit and the event's senior competition coordinator, noticed her because it was his job to notice things that didn't fit. He was a broad-shouldered man with 22 years on the force and the permanent squint of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. He flagged down his rookie handler, Officer Brent Atchison, on his way past. "Keep an eye on that woman at the east fence. She's been standing there since before the opening ceremony," Atchison nodded, casting a glance toward the fence. "You want me to move her along?" "Not yet. Just watch her." Atchison drifted toward the fence, positioning himself close enough to intervene, but not so close as to be confrontational. He was 24, sharp, and still in the phase of his career where he tried to look more authoritative than he felt. He settled near a support post and watched the woman from the corner of his eye. The opening ceremony began. Commander Lee Haskell, a decorated regional law enforcement director with a reputation for running tight events, took the podium at the center of the field. Her voice carried over the PA with the measured, unhurried cadence of someone who understood ceremony. "These animals represent the finest traditions of law enforcement partnership," she said, gesturing to the 8 dogs standing at the front of the formation. "They are not merely tools. They are colleagues. They have bled on the job. They have saved lives, and they have done it without asking for recognition." Polite applause moved through the bleachers. The 8 dogs didn't react. They were trained for exactly this: massive crowd noise, amplified sound, the smell of thousands of strangers. Their handlers stood at attention beside them, leashes slack. There was no need for tension. These animals were so deeply conditioned to public protocol that an earthquake could have split the field, and they would have held formation until commanded otherwise. The lead dog was a 6-year-old Belgian Malinois named Crest, partnered with the unit's top handler, Sergeant Cal Beaumont. Crest had a championship ribbon from the previous year and a tracking record that had made the regional news twice. Beside Crest stood Vex and Hollow and Dispatch, each as controlled and machine-like as the last. To the crowd, they were impressive. To the handlers, they were the product of years of grinding work. To the competition judges seated at the scoring table, they were percentages and point values. And then the wind shifted. It came from the northeast, a sudden gust that swept across the open fairgrounds and traveled the full length of the competition field. It carried the smell of the parking lot, the food vendors, the diesel generators. It carried the smell of dead leaves and October mud, and it carried something else. Crest's head turned first, not toward the field, not toward the crowd, toward the east fence. His ears, which had been pinned flat in disciplined attention, rotated forward with sudden violent precision. His nostrils opened wide. The motion was small, barely 2 inches of movement, but Sergeant Beaumont felt it instantly through the leash. He glanced down and frowned. Crest was vibrating, not in fear, not in aggression. In something Beaumont had never once seen from his dog in 4 years of partnership. Recognition. Crest! Beaumont kept his voice low and controlled. Crest! Hold! Crest did not hold. A sound left the dog, a high, raw whine that rose and broke midway, the kind of sound that belonged to animals in pain, or animals who had waited for something so long that the waiting had become its own kind of wound. It was not a trained sound. It was not a tactical sound. It was the sound of a creature who had no language for what it was feeling and was making one up on the spot. Beaumont pulled at the leash. Crest didn't move toward the formation. He moved toward the fence. Then Vex broke. Then hollow. The formation collapsed within 4 seconds. All 8 dogs were pulling against their leads simultaneously, dragging their handlers in different directions before converging with terrible clarity of purpose toward the east end of the fence. It happened so fast that the crowd didn't process it as a threat at first. There was a stunned collective silence before someone screamed, and then the bleachers erupted. "Hold your animals!" Commander Haskell's voice cut through the PA. "Handlers, secure your units!" But the handlers were already losing. Dispatch overpowered Officer Atchison in one lateral lunge, ripping the leash from his grip entirely. Crest had his jaws on his own lead and was shaking it like prey. The Belgian Malinois, a dog trained to subdue men twice his size, hit the chain-link fence at speed, then reversed and found the gap in the portable fencing near the corner support post, and he was through it. Beaumont shouted his name. Crest did not stop. The crowd scattered backward from the east fence. People knocked over bleacher seats. A child was lifted clear of the ground by her father. Competition judges abandoned the scoring table. Officers along the perimeter drew their radio handsets and started shouting unit designations. Soleil Adair didn't move. She had seen the dogs come. She had seen Crest break first. Something in her face had changed when the whine left his chest. Her jaw had dropped, slightly. The way jaws drop when you see something you believed impossible happening right in front of you. Her hands were still on the fence, knuckles white, and she was crying before any of the dogs reached her. Not quietly. The way people cry when they've been holding it back for a very long time and the thing they've been waiting for finally arrives. Crest hit her in the chest at full speed. She went down hard onto one knee, arms going around the dog instinctively, and Crest was pressing the full weight of his 75-pound body against her, whimpering, pushing his face into the crook of her neck. He was not biting. He was not threatening. He was shaking. Vex arrived next, then Hollow, then the others in a cascading rush of paws and tactical harnesses and desperate, frantic whines. They piled against her and around her and under her arms. One was licking tears off her face. One had his head in her lap. One kept standing up and sitting down, unable to contain itself, tail sweeping in violent arcs. "Good boys," Soleil kept saying, her voice cracked and barely audible under the noise of the crowd. "Good boys, I know. I've got you. I'm right here." Officer Atchison stopped 6 feet away. He had arrived at a run with his hand on his baton, and a mouth full of commands that died completely when he saw what was happening. He had no protocol for this. Sergeant Beaumont pushed through the last of the crowd at a dead sprint and pulled up short, chest heaving, staring at his dog. Crest, who had once bitten through a car door to reach a suspect, was draped across the lap of a woman in a mud-colored jacket, making sounds Beaumont had never heard from him. The sounds of an animal relieved of a burden it had been carrying in silence. "What is this?" Beaumont said, not aggressively. He said it the way a man says something when the world has briefly stopped making sense. Soleil looked up at him from the ground, surrounded by 8 championship police dogs, her face wet and her voice completely level. "I think they remember me," she said. The fairgrounds event tent was not built for interrogations. It was built for livestock awards and county agricultural displays, and it still smelled faintly of hay and engine oil. Someone had dragged in a folding table and 4 mismatched chairs, and the yellow overhead lighting made everything look slightly worse than it was. Commander Lee Haskell sat on one side of the table. Sergeant Beaumont stood at the door with his arms crossed, still processing. Captain Thurlow sat to Haskell's right, a yellow legal pad in front of him with nothing written on it yet. Soleil Adair sat across from them, her canvas tote bag on the floor at her feet. Crest was pressed against her right leg under the table. No one had been able to move him. They'd stopped trying after the 3rd attempt. The other 7 dogs were in the adjacent pen with their handlers. But the handlers had reported, with varying degrees of discomfort, that the dogs kept orienting toward the tent wall, pressing against it, lying against it, facing the direction of the woman on the other side. "Miss Adair," Haskell began, her tone careful and measured. "I want to understand what just happened out there." "I know what it looked like," Soleil said. "Tell me what it actually was." Soleil reached into her tote bag and set a folder on the table. It was the kind of folder that had been handled a great deal, the edges soft, the cover discolored from being opened and closed. She slid it across to Haskell without ceremony. "I ran a program out of Pickett County," she said, "a civilian working dog rehabilitation program. I started it when I was 23, no federal funding. I applied 7 times and got denied 7 times, so I funded it through private donations and the money I made breaking horses on weekends." She nodded at the folder. "The intake records are in there, the veterinary assessments, the training logs." Haskell opened the folder. The first page was an intake form dated almost 4 years earlier. The dog listed was a Belgian Malinois, male estimated age 2 years, found in a collapsed meth house in rural Pickett County with bilateral rib fractures and a leg wound that had gone untreated for an estimated 3 weeks. Intake weight, 31 pounds. Haskell looked up. "This dog's name is listed as Cricket. That's what I called him," Soleil said. "You call him Crest." Beaumont took a step away from the door. "The wound pattern on his left rear leg," Soleil continued, her voice staying steady. "There's a scar about 2 inches below the hock. It goes diagonal. Dr. Petra Navarro at the Pickett County Animal Clinic did the surgery. She used a tension band wire technique because she couldn't get the bone fragment to hold otherwise. I have the surgical record." Thurlow looked at Beaumont. Beaumont's jaw was set. "I know about the scar. I was told it was from a high-speed obstacle course training injury, that it happened in Germany before import." Soleil's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes hardened. He was never in Germany. She opened the folder to a second page. Intake photograph. A Malinois, clearly Crest, the same bone structure, the same dark muzzle, lying on a stainless steel veterinary table, ribs visible under his coat, looking at the camera with the flat, exhausted gaze of an animal that had given up. Beaumont came to the table and looked at the photograph for a long time. "Walk us through it," Thurlow said quietly. Soleil leaned back slightly and pressed her hand once to the top of Crest's head, feeling him press back against her palm. "I found Cricket first. That was 4 years ago. The Pickett County Sheriff's Office called me after a drug raid on an abandoned property on Route 7. They found 5 dogs in the crawl space. 2 were already dead. 2 others had to be euthanized at the scene. Cricket was the only one who had anything left." She paused. "I drove out there at 2 in the morning and carried him to my truck. The other 7 dogs in the unit," Haskell said. "You're going to tell me you know all of them." Vex was a bait dog from a fighting operation in the next county over. He had bite marks across his chest and face, and someone had cut his left ear partway off. I called him Pepper because he used to sneeze constantly the first month I had him. Turned out he was allergic to the pine shavings in his kennel. I switched to cedar, and it stopped. She looked at Thurlow, check his left ear. The cut was sutured, but the cartilage didn't fully heal. There's a ridge along the fold. Thurlow wrote something on his legal pad. Hollow, I called him Dusk, came from an animal control hold in the next county. He'd been surrendered 3 times. The official record said, dangerous, unmanageable, bite history. He bit me twice in the first week. I have the scars. She held up her left forearm briefly, then set it back on the table. By week 3, he was sleeping on my feet. How many dogs did you have in total? Haskell asked. At peak capacity, 11. 8 of those are in this competition. 2 others were adopted into homes. 1, Birch. I lost to kidney failure 2 years ago. A beat of silence. I still have his collar. The tent was very quiet. How did they get here? Thurlow said, and the question landed the way it always does when someone already suspects the answer and is hoping they're wrong. Soleil's jaw tightened. A man named Stuart Pell. He worked for a private tactical canine procurement firm called Turnian Canine Solutions. He came to my facility 14 months ago. He drove a white pickup with out-of-state plates, and he had documents from what looked like a state agency, an animal welfare compliance audit. She stopped. I had been flagged for zoning violations by the county. I knew it was coming. I'd been operating on an agricultural exemption that was technically a year out of date. I was trying to fix it. She pressed her lips together briefly. Pell said the audit had found my facility non-compliant. He had county deputies with him. They said every dog on the premises was being seized pending a compliance review, and that I would face criminal liability for continuing to operate without proper certification. She looked at Haskell directly. I asked to see the specific violation orders. He handed me a stack of papers and talked very fast while I tried to read them. I was 27 years old and I was alone, and I had 8 dogs who trusted me, and I panicked. She said the last part without self-pity, just as fact. By the time I understood what was actually happening, they had them all loaded. Haskell had gone very still. Pell told me the dogs would be evaluated and, given their behavioral histories, would most likely be euthanized within 60 days. He said that was the standard outcome for dogs with documented aggression and bite histories. Soleil's voice dropped a fraction. He looked me in the eye when he said it, like he was doing me a courtesy by being honest. But they weren't euthanized, Beaumont said. No, because there was never any compliance audit. There was never any state agency involvement. Stuart Pell fabricated the documentation, used real deputy vehicles. I found out later that 2 of the deputies he brought were former officers who'd left the force under investigation for unrelated conduct. Pell's firm sold all 8 dogs to various law enforcement agencies as, quote, imported European working dogs with certified military pedigrees. Each dog sold for between $40,000 and $65,000. She looked at the folder on the table. I have a copy of Turnian Canine Solutions invoices. I got them through a civil records request 8 months ago. Thurlow set down his pen. How did you find this competition? Haskell asked. I've been looking for them for 14 months, Soleil said simply. I filed a report with the Pickett County Sheriff the week after the seizure. They said there was no evidence of fraud, that the documentation Pell provided appeared legitimate. I filed with the state AG's office. I got a form letter. I hired a paralegal I couldn't really afford, and she helped me trace the procurement records. She reached into the tote bag and pulled out a second folder, thicker. Last month I found an invoice that matched Cricket, to a sale to the Harwick County Regional K9 training program. I drove here yesterday. I parked in the fairground lot and I didn't know what I was going to do. I just needed to see if it was really him. Beaumont sat down heavily in the empty chair at the end of the table. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, the day Crest came in, he was completely feral. He had to be sedated for his initial exam. It took 6 weeks before any handler could get within arm's length without full protective gear. He looked at Soleil. The training coordinator said it was high drive from European protection sport training, that it was normal for import dogs to have an adjustment period. It wasn't adjustment, Soleil said. He was terrified. He had spent most of his life being hurt by people. It took me 8 months before he would sleep through the night. She paused. What finally got through to him was that I sat outside his kennel every morning and read out loud, nothing specific, the news, instruction manuals, whatever I had, just so he could hear a calm voice without anything being asked of him. Beaumont said nothing for several seconds, then, "He still doesn't like silence. I leave a radio on in the kennel." Soleil looked at him. The ghost of a smile crossed her face and disappeared. "Cedar, not pine, for his bedding, and he won't eat from a metal bowl. It has to be ceramic." Beaumont closed his eyes briefly. "I switched him to ceramic 3 months in. I thought it was just a preference." Haskell stood up. She moved to the end of the table and stood with her hands on the back of Thurlow's chair, looking at the 2 folders laid open on the table. The intake records, the surgical reports, the procurement invoices, the paper trail of a fraud built on 8 animals who had been thrown away once and rescued, and then stolen. "Stuart Pell," she said. "Turnion K9 Solutions is currently registered in Delaware," Soleil said. "Their physical address is a mail forwarding service, but their procurement liaison, a woman named Carries Dunn, still has an active LinkedIn profile. She sold 3 dogs to a department in Ohio 6 months ago." Haskell turned to Thurlow. "Get me the department's legal counsel. Tonight. It's Saturday. I'm aware of what day it is." Thurlow was already reaching for his phone. The tent went quiet, except for the sound of Crest's breathing, and somewhere outside the distant noise of the fairground handlers trying to manage 7 dogs who kept pressing against the tent wall, facing inward, waiting. What followed was not quick. These things never are. Haskell's legal counsel arrived within 2 hours and spent the first 45 minutes reviewing the documentation. Soleil had assembled over 14 months with the methodical focus of someone who understood that paper trails either hold or they don't. And this one held. Every dog in the Harwick County K9 unit had a legitimate intake record at Soleil's facility. Every surgical note matched a scar the department's own veterinarian had on file and had been told was a training artifact. Every invoice in Turnion's records showed a sale price that had been processed through the department's tactical procurement budget. Public funds, formally allocated, now confirmed to have paid for stolen animals. Beaumont stepped out of the tent while the lawyers talked. He walked to the adjacent pen and stood with his arms on the railing, watching Crest through the gap in the tent canvas. Still pressed against Soleil's leg, still pressed against her hand. Officer Ackerson came to stand beside him. "You knew something was off," Ackerson said carefully. It wasn't a question. Beaumont was quiet for a moment. "Not about the procurement. I had no reason to doubt that." He paused. "But Crest, from the first week, he didn't behave like a dog trained in a European program. He behaved like a dog who had been loved a specific way and was looking for it again and couldn't find it." He looked at his hands on the railing. "He used to do this thing in the evenings where he'd go to the kennel door and just sit there facing it. Not anxious, not barking, just sitting there, like he was waiting for someone who was late coming home." Ackerson didn't say anything. "I figured it was just a quirk," Beaumont said. "A lot of working dogs have them." Inside the tent, Commander Haskell emerged from the legal conversation and pulled her chair back to the table. She sat down across from Soleil, with her hands folded in front of her. "Miss Adair, I want to be direct with you. The documentation you've provided is credible. Our counsel believes it's sufficient to support both a criminal referral for Stuart Pell and a civil recovery action. We will refer this to the State AG's office this week with our full endorsement, which is different from a private citizen filing, and it will be treated differently." A beat. "I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry the system failed you the first time you reported it." Soleil received this without visible emotion, the way people receive apologies for things that cost them too much to feel relieved by words about it. "The dogs," she said. "That's what I want to talk about." Haskell waited. "I didn't come here to take them back." Soleil looked down at Crest and was quiet for a moment. "I live in a 2-room apartment in the same town where I grew up. I work at a landscape nursery 4 days a week, and I rehabilitate the occasional dog on the side when I have the space and the money for it. I don't have a facility anymore." She stroked Crest's ear once, slowly. "And these dogs are good at their jobs. I can see that. I followed the competition records for the ones I could identify. Crest has a tracking clearance rate that most handlers would spend a career chasing." "He does," Beaumont said from the tent entrance, where he had quietly returned. Soleil looked at him. "You're good with him." Beaumont crossed to the table and sat down without being invited. "He's the best partner I've ever had." He said it without inflation, just as a statement of fact. I'd like to think I'd know if he wasn't okay. But after today, he stopped. I don't know what I would have done if he'd had that look every day. That waiting look, and I'd just kept telling myself it was a quirk. The tent was silent long enough that the noise from the fairground filtered back in. Vendors, generators, the distant sound of a PA system resuming a scaled-back version of the afternoon schedule. "I want them to stay," Soleil said. "I want them to stay with their handlers and keep doing their jobs. That's not a sacrifice. That's actually what I want." She pressed her mouth together briefly. "What I needed was to know they were okay. I needed to stop imagining them the way they looked in those intake photos, because that's where they've been living in my head for 14 months. She looked at Haskell. "I just needed to know they made it." Haskell was quiet. "They more than made it," Beaumont said. Outside, Stuart Pell was arrested on a Monday, 3 weeks later, at a storage unit in Virginia where Turnian K9 Solutions kept its operational records, which turned out to be significantly more comprehensive than Pell had apparently anticipated they would ever need to be. The state AG's office had moved with unusual speed, motivated in part by the involvement of 8 active law enforcement assets, 8 agencies' worth of procurement records, and a paper trail assembled by a 28-year-old woman with no legal training and a paralegal she'd paid in installments. Carries Dunn was arrested the same morning at her home in Columbus. The charges were extensive. The Harwick County K9 unit returned to active duty the following week. Legally, the situation had required some creative navigation. The dog's official certifications were now of questionable provenance, since their entire documented histories had been fabricated. It took 6 weeks, and the cooperation of 3 veterinary specialists, including Dr. Petra Navarro from Pickett County, who drove 4 hours to provide records and testimony to establish a legitimate certification path forward. At the recommendation of Commander Haskell and with the unanimous support of every handler in the unit, the department created a new civilian position, Working Dog Welfare and Behavioral Consultant. The posting offered a modest salary, benefits, and a dedicated workspace at the K9 facility. The duties included behavioral assessment, handler training support, and oversight of rehabilitation integration for any future K9 acquisitions. The position was offered to Soleil Adair on the last day of October, in the same agricultural tent where she had sat across from 2 commanders and a sergeant, and explained herself with a battered folder and a dog pressed against her leg. She read the offer letter twice. Then she looked at Thurlow, who had delivered it in person. "I don't have a degree," she said. "I'm qualified exactly as much as the work I've done qualifies me." "I know what you're qualified by," Thurlow said. "So does Commander Haskell. So does every handler who watched what happened at that fence." She asked for a day to think about it. She thought about the 2-room apartment. She thought about the nursery job, about the plant deliveries and the early mornings, and the part-time rehabilitation work she squeezed in around the edges of everything else, because it was the only thing that felt like it was actually hers. She thought about 14 months of filing reports and getting form letters, and driving alone to a county fairground on a Saturday morning without a plan. She called Thurlow the next morning at 7:45. The first day she walked onto the Harwick County K9 training field in an official capacity. It was a grey November morning, cold enough to see your breath. She came through the side gate with her canvas tote bag over her shoulder and a ceramic bowl she'd brought from home for Crest, because she didn't trust that the facility would have one in the right size. She was halfway across the field when 8 dogs broke formation simultaneously and ran to her. The handlers stood and watched it happen and did not try to stop it. Beaumont was laughing. It was the involuntary kind, the kind that comes up before you have a chance to decide whether it's appropriate, and it sounded like relief. Soleil went down on one knee in the wet grass and let them find her, all 8, falling over each other, whining and pressing and circling and coming back again. She got mud on her jacket and grass on her jeans, and she didn't notice either thing. She had been looking for them for 14 months. She found them the way the lost things always get found, in the end. Not through the right channels or the right timing or any particular grace from the systems that were supposed to prevent the loss in the first place, but through the stubborn, unglamorous refusal to stop looking. Crest put his head in her lap and exhaled. She pressed her forehead against his and stayed there until the cold stopped feeling like cold.